This is the end of Hong Kong. This is the end of one country, two systems. Make no mistake about it.
To say Hong Kong is dead, it sounds like an exaggeration designed to grab the headlines. But for many people on the island, we are indeed witnessing the beginning of the end of Hong Kong. They say that China's plan to introduce a new so-called security law will end the freedom they've enjoyed for decades and will make them as oppressed and monitored as people on the mainland. And this could all happen within days. In fact, China's parliament is expected to pass the law before the end of this month, totally bypassing Hong Kong's own legislative council. Britain, the former colonial ruler of Hong Kong, is concerned, and Prime Minister Boris Johnson says his government is willing to offer a path to British citizenship to 3 million people on the island if the law goes ahead. Can China be stopped, for example, at the United Nations? Will there be a Hong Kong exodus? And will Britain be better or worse off? We'll ask our panel, including Emily Lau, the first woman to be democratically elected to Hong Kong's Legislative Council back in 1991. And we'll hear from Ben Loughnane in London, who thinks the British government is making a big mistake. But first, let's take a look at what this new security law actually entails, and then try to work out why so many people in Hong Kong are afraid of it.
Pro-democracy activists in Hong Kong are calling for people to rise up against China's plan to impose national security legislation on the city. The controversial legislation is being seen as a direct attack on the region's autonomy.
China has proposed a new law that could end any dream of democracy for Hong Kong.
For the first time, it has imposed a law carrying criminal penalties without any consultation.
The proposal itself aims to tackle secession, it says, subversion, terrorism, foreign interference, and would set up Beijing intelligence agencies in Hong Kong.
Within months or even weeks, any form of subversion will be outlawed, and Chinese security forces could enter the city to end unrest.
It's part of Beijing's response to those massive protests that swept through the city last year.
People are very concerned about the new legislation. They fear that this would be a further repression on the remaining free speech and the freedom of expression.
This was not supposed to happen, at least not for the first 50 years, but it's happening right now.
Hong Kong is a free society. Hong Kong will remain to be a very free society.
要是一国两制，行稳致远，维护香港长期繁荣。
This is the end of Hong Kong. This is the end of one country, two systems. Make no mistake about it.
It will be one country, one system. And Hong Kong will become just another Chinese city. And that's terrible. Since President Xi Jinping came to power, things got very difficult. And now, this is the pits.
Okay, let's bring in our guest now, and we have Emily Lau, and you saw her ending that report, so you know her perspective on this issue. And in Beijing, we have Aina Tangen, who is an academic who lives there and is going to help to give China's perspective on this entire issue. Emily, I'd like to start with you. It's a simple question, really. We've heard people saying that this new security law spells the end for Hong Kong as we know it. Is that an exaggeration? Or are they serious?
Well, I think it's not an exaggeration because Hong Kong, as we know it, is under Beijing's policy of one country, two systems. Although we are part of the People's Republic of China, but the people here enjoy many freedoms, human rights, the rule of law, and personal safety, much more than the people in mainland China. And that's what China promised us when Britain handed Hong Kong over, in 1997. But if this law, this national security law is passed, and if they enforce it very, very harshly, we could be like people living in Shanghai or in Guangzhou or in Sichuan. We will have no personal safety, no protection of human rights. and it would be terrible, really terrible.
And I understand that China is planning to pass this law without asking Hong Kong's Legislative Council, which you had 7 terms in, I believe, asking them to pass the law.
Exactly, because under our basic law, which is our mini constitution given to us by Beijing, we didn't write it. Beijing wrote it, gave it to us. In the basic law, Article 23 said Hong Kong should legislate on its own on laws on national security. But of course, since 1997 up to now, we still have not done it because the proposals were very harsh and the people resisted. And now suddenly, bingo, Beijing said, okay, you didn't do it. Now we're going to do it for you. And we have not seen the draft of the law. Nobody in Hong Kong, including Chief Executive Carrie Lam and all those pro-communist politicians, none of them have seen it. The Legislative Council cannot discuss it, cannot even ask a question on it. And in a few days' time, they say they're going to pass it, and it will be enforced.
I know you can understand that Emily and a lot of people in Hong Kong are very worried that the law which covers succession, subversion, terrorism, foreign interference could be used as a pretext to crack down on their freedoms, to not allow them to have protests, for example. And they're also outraged that China is bypassing Hong Kong's Legislative Council.
Well, to be perfectly clear, I mean, China could do this at any time. It's you know, the bigger nation, but it hasn't done so. So the real question is, why did it take so long? Why didn't 1997 when they should have done this? Now, Emily, you were there for 7 terms. You therefore bear some responsibility for the fact that this was never passed. You can say that, oh, people didn't like it, but why? What were the proposals that were made? Now, you've ignored the elephant in the room, which is the fact that Hong Kong is now a failed city. You have a situation where people are moving out their money and their people out in droves because they can't do business there. You have 5 million people who are dependent on the local economy, tourism, etc. They're in deep, deep despair. And it's understandable that people were very unhappy. But why aren't you pointing the finger at those who have been controlling Hong Kong for all of these years, the oligarchs who seem to own everything that everybody needs on a daily basis? I don't hear anything about that.
Let's give Emily a chance to respond to that, Emily.
This is just a way of trying to control the narrative, but without any end. Hong Kong isn't going anywhere.
Well, the thing is, I mean, we know we live under communist rule, but the Communist Party gave an undertaking when they signed the joint declaration with Britain in 1984. And then they said we could enjoy freedoms, our human rights, personal safety for 50 years, from 97 up to 2047. And in 2003, the administration of C.H. Tung tried to legislate on Article 23, which is about national security. But the terms were so harsh, the people were very scared. And what they tried to do, amongst other things, was to criminalize free speech. Just imagine. That means you cannot have academic freedom, freedom of religion, freedom of the press. All those things would go out the window. That's why we have close to 1 million people marching. And the bill was abandoned.
The proposed law. They were talking about anti-succession, preaching against the government, the very one that you say, acknowledge, is part of the system that you talked about. There was a 50-year transition period. But that does not mean that you can have people out there actively advocating for an independent Hong Kong.
Now, you've both mentioned the Sino-British joint declaration that was signed in 1984. We have some pictures of it there. There is Margaret Thatcher signing it in Beijing. And we have it in black and white, don't we? Hong Kong will enjoy a high degree of autonomy, except in foreign and defense affairs. And further down the page, you can see it says the current social and economic systems in Hong Kong will remain unchanged, and so will the lifestyle. Rights and freedoms, including those of the person, of speech, of the press, of assembly, will be ensured by law in Hong Kong. So I know the concern is here that this new security law will breach that agreement.
Well, we haven't seen it, but I'm pretty certain that it won't breach that agreement. What the mainland is concerned about is law and order on the streets. The first duty of any government is to ensure the public safety, not only in your home, but at your schools, your workplace, and in the streets. If you cannot do that, you are a failed government. So absolutely, Hong Kong is a failed state at this point. It needs help. You know, remember, this is not a situation where it's
a lot of people,
pressed area.
A lot of people would look at Hong Kong and say you cannot possibly call a wealthy, entrepreneurial, go-getting island like Hong Kong a failed state. Emily, come in.
Yes, of course. I mean, yeah, we have in the past 12 months or more, we have seen a lot of protests and a lot of brutality, police brutality, a lot of violence, and it has, upset a lot of people. But you must understand, the people were angry last year because of Carrie Lam's effort to enact an extradition bill whereby people could be sent to mainland China for trial. And over there, there's complete lawlessness. That's why people are terrified. And why should we be sent over there? We have one country, two systems. So Carrie Lam is the main culprit for causing this months and months of unrest and protests. And now, to top it all up, the mainland Chinese government said, we're going to give you a national security law, which will be like driving a truck through one country, two systems. And if that's enforced, it's one country, one system.
Emily,
the joint commission is going
chicken
the
little
window.
approach to the situation,
let's go back.
Which is untrue. Carrie Lam was reacting to a situation in which a Hong Kong man took his girlfriend to Taiwan, killed her, and then escaped back to Hong Kong. He was being held. Where is he today? Why is there no justice for that young girl and her family? Why? Because there was no extradition treaty. That is also something that you bear responsibility for, Emily. You were in there. Why didn't you? Why there were attempts to have extradition laws? You did nothing. So at this point, to cry that it's somehow Carrie Lam's fault and that the lawlessness in the street is a reaction to China, mainland, it's silly.
I think you've got the facts wrong. Of course, we want to help to resolve the Taiwan murder. And if Carrie Lam had introduced a bill just for extradition to Taiwan, the thing would have been resolved very quickly. But no, she was greedy. She wanted to please the Communist Party. So instead of a bill just on extradition to Taiwan, she tied in everything. Extradition to Macau, to mainland China, and to all other countries that Hong Kong did not have extradition agreement. I think that was a fatal mistake, and she is a sinner for 1,000 years.
Well, we're going to look at the UK's proposal to offer Hong Kongers a path to citizenship in a moment. But first, a bit of history. You know, it's nearly 23 years to the day since the 1997 handover ceremony in the pouring rain, attended by Prime Minister Tony Blair, Hong Kong's last governor Chris Patten, and Prince Charles.
Britain is part of Hong Kong's history, and Hong Kong is part of Britain's history. We are also part of each other's future. We are confident that the ties between us will not only endure, but will continue to develop.
It has been the greatest honor and privilege of my life to share your home for 5 years and to have some responsibility for your future. Now, Hong Kong people are to run Hong Kong. That is the promise, and that is the unshakable destiny.
Well, that promise made back in 1997 that Hong Kongers would run Hong Kong is now looking rather shaky. And so the British government is looking at offering citizenship to up to 3 million people from the island. It's a big decision and it's a big announcement, made several times in the United Kingdom. But under the current circumstances, it may be that the public have missed its significance. Britain is suffering badly from the pandemic. A virus that began in faraway China is now affecting and permeating every aspect of British life, and it dominates the news. Even a government pledge to allow 3 million people to apply for citizenship has gone largely unnoticed.
Today, China's National People's Congress formally announced its decision to impose a national security law on the people of Hong Kong. If China goes down this path and implements this national security legislation, we will be required to change the status of B&O passport holders and set and train arrangements which allow them to come to the UK for longer than the current 6-month period and to apply for extendable periods of 12 months to work and study, which itself will provide a pathway to citizenship.
Now, B&O stands for British National Overseas, and B&O passports look almost identical to the regular UK passports, but there are key differences. A B&O passport holder does not have an automatic right to work or live in the UK. The holder is not a British citizen. 350,000 Hong Kongers have a B&O passport. Another 2.5 million are eligible to apply for one. The Prime Minister Boris Johnson wants to ensure they can all become British citizens if China's new security law is applied to Hong Kong. It would be, in his words, one of the biggest changes to Britain's visa system in history. He says Britain would be merely fulfilling its commitments to the people of Hong Kong. But what are those commitments? Until recently, the UK government argued that granting citizenship to B&O holders would breach the Sino-British Joint Declaration. And what of the government's commitment to the people of Britain? Boris Johnson won his election promising them to bring the overall immigration levels down.
The numbers will come down because we'll be able to control the system in that way. And what I don't think is right is to have an uncontrolled and unlimited approach to that.
Okay, well, you'll have noticed that Einar has gone, and in his place we have 2 new guests from London. Both are called Ben, but they have very different views on this subject. Ben Rogers is from Hong Kong Watch. He founded it, and he very much supports B&Os being offered a path to citizenship. And Ben Loughnane is from Migration Watch, and he actually opposes it. Ben Loughnane, let's start with you. What are your main concerns about this?
Well, fundamentally, as we always have this concern when we're talking about a high rate of immigration, is simply an issue of capacity. The UK is a small island nation. It does not have the capacity for an influx of 3 million people over a short period of time. At the moment, immigration is running at little under 300,000, so an increase of 10 times, that is, if we presume it's over the course of a year. But even over the course of 5 years, we're talking about a substantial increase in immigration on top of the current rates. Fundamentally, this is not what people voted for. They voted to reduce immigration overall, and that has been a pattern of voting for as long as mass immigration has been occurring. But more so than that, I actually think it's a terrible foreign policy decision. I think what's best for Hong Kong is not that we say to China, oh, we'll take all of these very vocal, very intelligent and very active citizens who are a huge thorn in your side and your ambitions, and we will bring them to the UK, where, you know, in Hong Kong over the past 23 years, China have been migrating 1.5 million people, I believe, who are Beijing loyal into Hong Kong. So they won't see any particular substantial hit. It's not as though every single Hong Konger is going to come to the UK. And also, fundamentally, when it comes down to it, if we offer, you know, we're going to take in 3 million Hong Kongers, and then none of them decide they want to come, or a very small number decide that they want to come, it would be the greatest international foreign policy humiliation this country has faced since the Suez Crisis.
Ben Rogers, a lot to unpack there and to counter from your point of view. Let's start with the size of the nation and the fact that the British government, Boris Johnson, won an election promising to bring down immigration overall.
And I just make 2 points. One is that Hong Kongers that do come to the UK, as well as us having a responsibility to help them, I think they actually will be a benefit to the UK because they are largely extremely entrepreneurial, dynamic people with their own wealth. They will not be a burden on the UK. They'll actually inject wealth and entrepreneurialism into our economy. But I would also say that we should be working with other countries to share responsibility and to develop a sort of lifeboat rescue package so that we don't actually have the situation where huge numbers all come to the UK alone.
Ben Loughnane, would that satisfy you?
Well, I absolutely agree that we can offer more than a lifeboat, but we do have to offer as a last resort. The problem is the government haven't offered this as a last resort. They've offered it in a very buccaneering and brash way. We'll take the entirety of Hong Kong's population who, yes, they are wonderful, bright, entrepreneurial, very beneficial people for us to have. But we've got, in terms of the UK, structurally, there aren't many places that people with those sorts of expertise can live and work. So what we would end up finding is that all of these people would be concentrated into small pockets, which are already considerably overcrowded, areas where there are severe housing shortages, where transport, certainly at rush hour, are absolutely heaving and very difficult to upgrade. And, you know, school places, GPs, hospitals, various other areas where, you know, the UK as a whole would need to see significant restructuring in terms of its economy, etc., in order to accommodate an influx of up to 3 million people.
And Ben Rogers mentioned that the United Kingdom has a responsibility for the people of Hong Kong, possibly even enshrined in the Sino-British Joint Declaration. What do you make of that?
I completely agree that the British government and the British people even have a responsibility, a moral duty to Hong Kong. The right policy would be to say Hong Kongers have a right to live and work and survive in Hong Kong. That is their home, that is where they are from, and that is where they deserve to have the right to stay. And I don't think we have the right not to ensure that Hong Kongers are allowed to remain in Hong Kong by taking the view of the only possible solution that we can offer is a path out of Hong Kong. But what about all the Hong Kongers who actually don't want to leave their homes and their jobs and their, you know, familiar surroundings?
Okay.
I think it'd be an enormous letdown.
Ben Rogers, back to you for the legal responsibilities. For years, even late last year, Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, was arguing that to offer BNOs a path to citizenship would be a breach of the Sino-British Joint Declaration.
Well, I'd make 2 points on that. The first is that the advice that the Foreign Office claimed to have been relying on was the advice of the former Attorney General, Lord Goldsmith. Now, earlier this year, Lord Goldsmith came out and said that was not his position at all, and that he does not see any legal reasons why the UK should not extend its protection for BNOs. But the second point I would make is that we're in a situation now where China has flagrantly and severely breached the Sino-British Joint Declaration, and we need to find ways to respond to that. And I think it's absolutely right to make the offer that Britain has made. But as I said earlier, where I agree with Ben is that should not be the first response or the only response. It should be the last resort, and we should be doing everything possible to help Hong Kong avoid getting into a situation where people need to flee.
Ben, the YouGov poll this month reported that the vast majority of people think there's been too much immigration over the past decade. So regardless of what they can bring for the economy, what about that view?
Well, what's very interesting is that, yes, there is a general poll arguing for lower levels of immigration, but equally there have been 2 polls recently that indicate a high level of support among the population for what's being proposed for Hong Kong. So I think there's that interesting contrast, and that's another reason why we should support this.
You may be referring to the YouGov poll that said, given the current situation in Hong Kong, would you support or oppose giving British national overseas passport holders from Hong Kong greater rights to come and live in Britain? Now, that question would indicate holders of British national overseas passports, right? That's a 350,000. So this question doesn't include the extra 2.5 million people who would be eligible to renew it. Is that right?
Yes, I think that probably is right, and maybe that question needs to be put again in regard to the larger number. And that's where I think the lifeboat policy needs to come in, where we need to do more to help those who don't currently have BNO passports, and indeed those who aren't even eligible, young activists who will be in particularly grave danger, who aren't protected by what the government's offered. And that's where we need to work with other countries to provide a rescue package should it be needed.
Emily, you've been listening to the debate by the two Bens. Can you just give me your response about BNOs and the path to citizenship?
Well, the Hong Kong people, particularly the BNO passport holders, they are very worried and very anxious. And they hope the British government and Parliament and the people of Britain would do something to help us. If you can stop the Chinese from cracking down on us so that we can continue to enjoy our freedoms, I think nobody would want to leave. But if things go horribly wrong, I think people look to Britain, the former colonial power, to help us. And Britain can work with its allies so that there would be an international lifeboat scheme to help Hong Kong people who want to flee. And so in these very difficult times, people of Hong Kong want Britain to help us.
Emily Lau, you get the final word. Thank you very much, and thank you to Ben Rogers and Ben Loughnane as well. And thank you at home for watching. Remember, you can see this episode and all our previous episodes on our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus TRT World. You can then subscribe, share, like, and the rest of it. Until next week then, goodbye.